offered. And so we want to make sure that we maintain the audio and visual support in the recordings. So we ask that you mute your lines as well as come off of webcam for only the presenters to speak. And that will kind of reduce the movement and background noise in the recordings when we post it on our max.gov pages. We will submit a post form survey at the end of today, where we will love your feedback. If you have insight and recaps of your sessions, that would be great. Please leave feedback in the survey, as well as any recommendations and or insights for future training and budget line of business events. So feel free to fill that out. You'll receive that this afternoon. As well as you can send us an email at budgetlob@ed.gov, and we'll manage your recommendations and insights there as well. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce you to our two speakers today. We have Dr. Andrew Prevard, the founder of the Federal Consulting Alliance, and he has led the budget processes. Oh, sorry, I just had a Ed IT window pop up. Apologies. All right, let me get restarted. So we have our first speaker up, Dr. Andrew Prevard. He is the founder of the Federal Consulting Alliance, has led the budget processes for the DC government, the U.S. Small Business Administration, and the U.S. Department of Treasury. He managed headquarter operations for the U.S. Department of Treasury and served as a chief of staff to the chief financial officer of the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. He also serves as our renowned training coordinator for the budget line of business. He is retired colonel in the Army Reserve after 32 years of career that included deployments to Desert Storm, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. He has earned a MA in economics from George Mason University and a PhD in political science from the Johns Hopkins University. We also have Mr. Rick Taylor, who has served over 34 years in the field of financial management and budgeting programs in defense, law enforcement, regulatory, and scientific agencies. He has extensive experience in federal working capital funds and appropriations in support of depot maintenance, major system acquisitions, and operations. Mr. Taylor is a graduate of James Madison University, the comptroller of the Navy's graduate level degree program, and Columbia University's executive development program. Without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Andy and Rick Taylor.
Thank you. All right, Rick, you're starting. Yep. So here are the objectives of what we want to cover today. Thank you for that introduction. We want to understand the timing of the federal budget process and how that fits together in the budget execution phase. If you attended our sessions yesterday, we concentrated on the formulation aspect of the budget. Today, we're going to concentrate on the execution phase. We're going to review some key terms to make sure we all have the same understanding, analyze the constitutional basis for appropriations, and review appropriations laws a little bit and how those impact how we can execute those funds. Discuss the importance of operating plans in the execution of the funds. Talk about warrants and apportionments and the role they play during the execution during the year, allocations and allotments and what some of those differences are, and talk about funds control. Look at some specific steps in the execution process, and then end with reporting, both year-end and periodic reporting during the year. So if there's no questions, I'll go ahead and move on. So here's the overall federal budget process. Again, if you attended the sessions yesterday, you've probably seen this, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. The formulation process is the beginning, kind of where agencies are soon to be or may already be for the FY25 process. So they're working on their budgets, and that will end up with them submitting to OMB in the fall, and then OMB working its process to consolidate and come up with the congressional budget request or the president's budget request to Congress. That'll start the congressional phase. The president's budget for FY24 was just released Monday of this week, so that phase just kicked off just 48 hours ago or so. Next is the execution phase, and that's where once the funds have been appropriated and provided by Congress, the agencies and departments will execute that funding in accordance with the constraints that are placed in the appropriation. So that's the phase we're going to concentrate on today. And then also concentrate a little bit on the kind of the sub phase of reporting. That'll be both for, as I said, the periodic reporting during the year and the year-end closeout reports. So I wanted to drill down a little bit on that execution, phase of the previous budget. You can see that it breaks into several big pieces. First is to analyze the appropriations law, make plans around that, apportion that funding, and allocate it to the offices as soon as it's available at the beginning of the year. Then, of course, the execution begins. And then once that, the fiscal year runs its course, ending in September, then there's year-end closeouts and final reports, agency financial reports, and things of that nature. So two purposes of budget execution, and one's kind of obvious, and the other one's just as important. The first one that's just as important is compliance with external requirements. So Part 4 in OMB Circular A11 provides the authoritative guidance that has to be followed. And even, on top of that is the law itself. The appropriation law dictates what can or can't be done with a given appropriation. And those vary from agency to agency. So it's important to look at, your agency's appropriation law to make sure what constraints or what flexibilities might be present in what Congress has provided to your agency. That's really the power of the purse that's often referenced, that Congress very jealously guards as a separate branch of government. And that's monitored through the audit process. So one of the big things that auditors, whether they be GAO or whether they be agency IGs, are looking at is, did the agency follow the constraints and the limits included in the appropriation law when they executed that funding? Did they properly execute the will of Congress? And lastly, of course, the obvious one is it facilitates the agency operations. As we know, if you've been around for some of the recent lapses in funding, if there's no appropriation, the vast majority of government functions have to stop. They can't continue without those appropriations. So the appropriations being present is what really enables the agency to execute their mission. They allocate their resources among their priorities, and they ensure that the money, the funding is available when needed. So some key terms, and you've probably seen these in several of the offerings during the forum yesterday and today, but again, just to make sure we're on the same page, obligations creates a binding commitment for the federal government to pay someone. So it's a legal obligation. Literally, that word is used both in the definition and the term. So it's when someone earns pay, a federal employee, a contracting officer signs a contract, a grant is awarded, or a loan is approved. That means that the government will pay out those funds, and at least the next term, or outlay those funds if the other party performs according to the terms of the agreement. So for a contract, that's they provide the goods or services as dictated by the contract. And the outlay is really when the funds leave the government. And so most of that is electronic, these days. It used to mean when they literally cut checks and mailed them out. And so the outlay is an important difference. Big difference in the obligation, because they can occur many, many months later or years later after an obligation is incurred. And outlays, are where, really what forms a lot of the current discussion right now about federal financing. If you've heard about issues such as the debt ceiling is triggered by the level of outlays versus the level of receipts. And whether or not that balance is maintained at a certain level. The government is allowed to incur debt, but it's the level of that debt that determines that. And outlays are what, part of the equation that drives that. Two other terms that are important are discretionary spending, and that's where budget authority and outlays are controlled by Annual Appropriations Act. So Congress has a discrete amount in the law that says, hereby provided or appropriated is, $1 million to do X, Y, or Z, the purpose. As opposed to that is what's called mandatory spending, or spending that's direct. And this is where Congress sets a criteria or describes under what terms the funding can be spent. And that's often things like Social Security, Medicaid payments. If someone meets the criteria defined by Congress, then the government is authorized to make payments to them. So those are established in permanent appropriations. And I love the word permanent because they're permanent until it's changed again. So Congress can revisit those things, but that doesn't rely on an annual discrete value from Congress. It's kind of set, and then it goes where it may from the people that qualify for the program. So a quick question, what are the two main purposes of federal budget execution? Please reply in the chat. Good. I see several responses about compliance with external requirements and facilitate agency operations. That's right. Those are the purposes of it. And again, facilitate agency operations is probably, I won't say the most important, but the most obvious. And of course, the compliance are very important. GAO writes lots of reports about agencies when they don't comply with external requirements on their appropriation. And so those can be reviewed there if you want to see what some problems other agencies have perhaps run into. Okay, Andy, over to you.
Hi, good morning. So for the next few slides, we're going to talk about analyzing appropriations laws. Now, we realize that this is kind of repeating some of the material that was covered in the earlier session today, reading appropriation law. We wanted each of these classes to be standalone, so that means there's some sort of redundancy. So I hope you'll bear with me. I am going to go relatively quickly because if you need to look at this in more detail, you can look at the previous classes slides and video. So next slide, please. Just a reminder that the constitutional requirement for appropriations is that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So one of the key purposes, the compliance part of budget execution, is to make sure that every dime spent by the agency is based on the authority of an appropriation or permanent law. So go to the next slide. So Congress has clarified and amplified the Constitution through a series of laws. And the first one is the Anti-Deficiency Act, which is actually a series of laws that are tied together. And this contains the most significant rules for governing the use of appropriation. And this appropriation prohibits 5 things: making or authorizing an obligation exceeding an amount available in appropriation. So you can't spend 1 dime more than what's in the appropriation law, either mandatory or discretionary. Involve the agreement in a contract or obligation before an appropriation is made. So you can't say, hey, the appropriation is coming and I'm going to sign a contract. You got to wait till the actual apportionment is done. So the law has to be passed and then the apportionment. So that's the third thing: making or authorizing an obligation exceeding an apportionment. We're going to talk about what an apportionment is later in this class. And then the fourth thing is making or authorizing an obligation exceeding an amount permitted by agency regulations. And again, we're going to cover this later in the session, but agencies are required to do allotments to subordinate organizations that limit their spending of these organizations. If you violate an allotment, it's also an Anti-Deficiency Act. And the final one that is accepting voluntary services unless expressly authorized in an appropriation. So one of the things they didn't want people to get around the control, Congress did not want the executive branch to get around control by accepting free services. So you can't volunteer for the federal government unless there's a law that says you can. And then there's the purpose statute. And the purpose statute provides that appropriations shall only be applied to the objects for which the appropriation's made. And there's something called the necessary expense doctrine, which says an expenditure that is not specifically provided for in an Appropriation Act is permissible if it is necessary and incident to the proper execution of the general purpose of the appropriation. So if you have an appropriation to manage a national park, you don't need an explicit appropriation to, say, cut grass or do maintenance, because those things are necessary and proper for the explicit purpose of maintaining a national park. And GAO has put together a test to determine if an appropriation is necessary expense. It must be a logical relationship to the purpose. So maintaining the grass or maintaining the grounds has a logical relationship to maintaining national parks. It must not be prohibited by law, and it must be something that falls within the scope. It must not be something that falls within the scope of another appropriation. The bona fide needs rule says basically that it's a timing rule that requires both the timing of the obligation and that there is a true need for the funds within the period of availability. So you can't do an obligation for a training session 3 years from now with this year's funding because there's no need for that training this year. So next slide. So again, the 4 types of appropriation laws: mandatory, we covered that. Budget authority provided by permanent laws, it's like Social Security. Discretionary is the regular appropriations that go through the appropriations process of appropriation committees. It's always limited by purpose, amount, and time. And then there's supplemental appropriations, which are passed to deal with emergencies. And then there's continuing resolution. So those are the 4 types of appropriation laws. We've covered that in other sessions. Go ahead. So a question, is the Children's Health Insurance Program in the Department of Health and Human Services funded by mandatory or discretionary budget authority? And you can see the little description from the law there. So what do you think? Is that mandatory or discretionary? So go to the, yeah, I've seen that most people are putting mandatory, but the way you check is you go to the President's Budget Appendix, and we covered this in formulation, and you look at what is the line number. And here the line number is 1200. And that, if you go to OMB Circular A11 and look into it, you will find that that is mandatory appropriations. So this is mandatory. There's a question, Bonafide, for no year funds, can you allocate funds beyond the current fiscal year? Yeah, it would, if the appropriation is no year funds, there's no time limit on the funds, so that part of it doesn't necessarily apply. The part of it that does apply, and Rick, check me if I'm saying this wrong, is that you still have to have a real purpose, right? You can't make up a new purpose no matter what the time is.
Right, the purpose is right. The purpose described in creating the no year funding has to be complied with. The bona fide needs rule, there actually there is no bona fide needs control on no year funds. It's kind of a unique little aspect of that because the funds are available until expended. So if they're available, you can use, maybe a no year appropriation from this fiscal year to fund requirements in the next year, or for more years than would typically be like a 1 year appropriation. You can't fund a 2-year period of performance on a contract. With no year funding, you can.
So this is a clip from, there's a question on what is this document. This is a clip from the President's Budget Appendix, and which is you can find it at OMB. At the OMB website. It's question, how is spending regulated for donations for those agencies that accept them? It's basically specified in a case by case in the law. So like VA has a series of laws that allow people to donate funds for various purposes, but the law has to tell you, you can't, like as an agency, you can't just say, hey, I think it'd be great to have people donate to help us out with our program. You can't just do that. You got to have a specific law that tells you how people can help, and you have to follow that law.
And also, if I may, so you have to have what's called receipt authority. You have to have the ability to take in receipts as an agency. And then those funds still often have to be apportioned. So even if you have that authority and a donor rolls in and wants to give you, $15 million to do something, you can't spend it until you work with OMB to get an apportionment of those funds, unless it's been exempted, and that's very rare.
So the question is, like, an example is the National Cemetery Administration of the Veterans Affairs. They have a gift fund set up that allows people to make donations into that fund who want memorials and things like that, put it in veteran cemeteries. And then those funds, once they're donated as receipts, are apportioned just like any other funds. There's a couple other questions, and I'm just going to, there's a question about mandatory versus discretionary, and I'd point you to yesterday's class on budget formulation where we went over that, but the majority of the budget is mandatory funding, and the biggest mandatory funding is Social Security and Medicare. Okay, one more question. So if the law states that folks can give additional money for rental authority and Congress agrees to allow it, we could use the money for rental assistance. You know, I'm going to be careful on this because what you need to do with these kind of questions is go to your agency appropriation law expert, right? Every budget office should have a connection to an appropriations lawyers because the law can become very complicated. And so my answer is go ask your appropriation law attorney. Because a lot of times it's governed by very, very specific statutes and very, very specific appropriation law language. So, so just a real quick where you can find appropriation laws. There's a couple of places you can find them, but where I like to go is this Congressional Research Service appropriation status table. And it shows you not only the laws, but also the various bills as it goes through the process. Next slide. So the first thing you do when you get when your agency's appropriation law is passed is you analyze it. And we covered it, and we talked about this in the earlier session with Tony McCann, did a great job walking everyone through this. And so I'm going to go kind of quickly. But when you analyze the law, you want to answer a series of questions. Who is receiving the appropriation? What is it for? How much? What is the period of availability? And what are the conditions on the use? So think of that as a checklist that you got to walk through. So next slide. So the question of who is receiving the appropriation, you know, the law will identify the department and the agency, the bureau, and the account. And these accounts then track back to Treasury account fund symbols from the what's called the FAST book, which is put out by Treasury. And that gives you the specific numbers. So notice that what on this, so on the right, what we have is the appropriation law. And then on the left, we have under this program and financing account is from the president's budget appendix. And you can see here that you have to do the crosswalk between what's in the president's budget request, that identification code 10102, and tie that to the title and the bureau and the account in the appropriation law. Next slide. So then you want to know what is the appropriation for, because remember, you can only spend things that Congress has explicitly told you you can do, that is explicitly defined the purpose. So usually, oftentimes, the appropriation law will cite the authorizing statute, and it'll say for necessary expense in carrying out the law that's identified there. But then they also get very specific about what may be purchased. And you can see here, they're allowed to include uniforms and cemetery expenses and one passenger motor vehicle. And then it also talks about transfers and things like that. Oh, the example here on the bottom, you get $25,000 for official reception and representation expenses. So in other words, you can't be going out and having big parties for more than $25,000. Next slide. And then it'll tell you how much, and you've got to find the number. And in here, in this case, it's this amount. And then in contrast for mandatory appropriations, they don't give you an amount. They tell you the conditions under which the money may be obligated and expended. Next slide. Then you ask the question of how long is the appropriation available? And so normally it's a 1 year period of availability. So for in this example, and if there's no date identified, it's just assumed to be 1 year. And then there is examples where they can have, in this example, it's some percentage of the appropriation, 10% in this example, is where it says remain available to September 30th, 2018. That means 10% of it is essentially 2-year funding. So that means if there's unobligated balances at the end of the year that's less than 10% or 10% or less, you can carry that over to the next year. And then there's 2-year funding is when you can notice here, it says 2018. Now this is a 2017 law. So the 18 is 2 years out, so it's a 2-year appropriation. So funding is then, there's also no year funding, which just says to remain available until expended. So that's the famous, everybody budget officer kind of likes that because then you have a lot of flexibility. So that's, next slide. So question, does your agency have 1 year, multi-year funding, or a combination? So most of you, if you're S&E account, you're probably 1 year, but sometimes you'll have a combination because you'll have like 1 year for S&E, but then maybe you have an IT project that's 2 years, or a large construction projects that's 2 years, or research. So a lot of agencies do. I see a lot of combination here, and that's not surprising. Big year, multi-year funding and no year funding is a little bit rare because Congress really does want to have control over what agencies spend money on. And when they do no year funding, they're kind of giving up some control. So I think I'll turn it over to Rick for the next section.
Actually, still you, Andy.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Next, what conditions are there in the use of appropriations? So Congress will put specific limitations on what things that you can't spend money on. So here, that none of the funds available for the Department of Veteran Affairs may be used to replace the current system of the Veterans Integrated Service Network. So they're telling you how to manage the agency here, and they're telling you can't spend money to do things that Congress doesn't want. They also put in reporting requirements where they want information, and they're requiring you the agency to provide that information. And sometimes they provide authority for transfers. And for example, they may say you can take money from your general operating expense account and transfer it to maybe the IT. In this case, it's the Veteran Board of Veteran Appeals, but a lot of times it's to transfer for IT operations or things like that. And they do allow sometimes agencies or departments to do root programming. They'll tell you in this instance, they're allowed to move $5 million around, but they put in the clause here to do more. It has to be approved by the Committee of Appropriations of both houses of Congress. Next slide. So Tony talked about this earlier, but we do have earmarks that come back, and you will need to pay attention as you analyze the law to identify earmarks. And we talked about that in the earlier session, but they're back. Next slide. And then transfers. Transfers is shifting of funds between different appropriation accounts. Transfers must be enacted by Congress. So if you're at VA, you can't just take money from the Veterans Health Administration and move it over to the National Cemetery Administration. You need to have a transfer. It is not uncommon for unforeseen budget requirements to be covered by transfer language in an Appropriations Act in lieu of Congress providing new funding. So if your agency finds it's got an unexpected expense and Congress doesn't want to increase the funding for the agency, they'll tell you to transfer funds around to solve the problem. But transfers go through the same apportionment process that we're going to talk about later. Some agencies, such as cabinet level departments, have a general transfer language in the Appropriation Act that allows them to transfer funds between accounts within the agency. But this is usually a relatively small amount. So Congress doesn't want to be bothered every time an agency goes, a subcomponent or a bureau within an agency goes a little bit over their budget. They give the secretary the ability to move some money around, but it's usually not very much. Next slide. And so this is kind of what, this is something that a budget office usually generates, and they usually construct a table that summarizes information in the appropriation law. And there's usually 1 or 2 people within a budget office that as soon as the appropriation law is passed, they are given the task to construct this table. And it usually what it does is it lists the different accounts down as the rows, and then it shows the different stages in the congressional process, and they keep track of that. And this becomes the beginning point for requesting apportionments and warrants. Next slide. So just a reminder here, the life cycle of budget authority, there's the unexpired phase, which means the budget authority is available to incur new obligations. So for a 1-year fund, the unexpired phase is 1 year. If it's 2-year funding, it's 2 years. Then there's what's called the expired phase. The budget authority is not available to incur new obligations, but it is available to pay bills. So let's say you have a 1-year budget authority, but you got a contract for a new IT system that's going to take 4 years to implement, and that the contract says the contractor gets paid only at the end of the implementation. So that means you will obligate the contract during the unexpired phase, but then 4 years later, when the contractor finishes delivering the information technology system, then you pay them. Now, general rule is that this phase lasts for 5 fiscal years. In other words, you have 5 years from the time that money expires to the time, the time the budget authority expires to the time when you have to have paid all the obligations off for the bill. And occasionally there's a law that can extend this 5-year period. After the 5th year, it's the cancel phase, when appropriation is closed and you can't obligate money against it, and you can't outlay money. You can't expend money on it. Now, annual and multi-year budget authority expire and are canceled after 5 years. So no year budget authority has only an unexpired phase. So because you can obligate funds for as long as you have them. Does the 5-year term, it begins the year that it expires. So if it's a 2-year budget authority, then the beginning of the 3rd year is when they start counting the 5 years for the expired phase. S&E stands for, salaries and expense. I'm just reading the questions in the chat as I go. Next slide. Okay, and Tony covered this again last class, but appropriation reports provide amplification on what Congress intends. Now, they accompany appropriation acts, and they can have House and Senate Appropriation Committee reports. You can have conference committee reports, and sometimes report language is only available in the congressional record. The report language serves 2 broad purposes. It explains the provisions to the chapters that will subsequently be included in the bill. So the appropriation committees are telling you and telling the world, the citizens, what they expect the bill to ultimately do. It's amplification of what's going on. It communicates the legislative intent. It tells you why they're doing what they do. Although report language is not considered binding in the same manner as language in the statute, agencies ignore report language at their peril. In other words, if you disrespect Congress and don't do what they want you to do, they will punish you the next time the appropriation bill goes before them. And one of the common ways that they do that is they defund, like, the office of the secretary. They will make it painful for the agency that ignores their reports. Report language usually includes a section-by-section analysis of each count and a table that provides a comparative statement of new budget authority in the bill. So when you do your planning, and we're going to cover planning for the budget execution, you need to consult the appropriations reports. The language may also include general directions, reporting guidelines, definitions of programs, projects, and activity. House and Senate rules also mandate that committee reports for general appropriation measures provide lists of appropriations not authorized by law. So they'll tell you what you cannot do. And finally, the House has additional requirements for rescissions and transfers, as well as language changing existing laws that may be listed in committee reports. Okay, next slide. So what are some of the types of conditions that can be placed on the execution of budget authority? What have you guys seen? Like, give us some examples from your agency. I mean, things like one of the things I saw very early in my career was they said that the political appointees could not stop the agency budget director from talking to Congress, because they were upset because the political appointees had given direction to the budget director. He wasn't allowed, it was a he in this case, wasn't allowed to talk to the Congress. And the appropriators got upset about that, so they wrote into the law that they couldn't use funding to block the budget director from talking to Congress.
I've got a unique one, Andy, that's still in place. There's what's called the SEC Reserve Fund that was created by Dodd-Frank and provides funding for the Securities and Exchange Commission. And it specifically says it's not an appropriation, it's funded by a fee structure, but Congress puts in a requirement that every time any money is obligated from that fund, they have to receive notification within 15 days. So every time we obligated a penny, we had to write a letter to both appropriations committees, majority and ranking members, that, what the obligation was. It was about a 3-page letter if we obligated so much as a penny, because there was additional table requirements we had to show, how the funding was being executed every single time we obligated funding.
Yep. Okay, back to you, Rick.
All right, now we're going to talk about operating plans, or planning in general for funding under execution. So, the question always is, okay, so why do this? Why do we, want to take the time to make these plans? Well, there's an old saying that says a failure to plan is a plan to fail. And that really applies here, especially with full year appropriations often not enacted until the second quarter or later the year. You really only have, about 9 months to execute that funding. So having a good plan in place allows the agency to step off and really start achieving their objectives smartly. It also ensures that resources are allocated to the priorities of the agency. It's not just what program or agency element tends to spend their money first. It ensures funds are available when needed, and that also goes back to apportionments, and most apportionments are done on a quarterly basis. The agency needs to understand when they need funding for certain things to make sure their apportionment supports that. It ensures that the funds can be spent in accordance with law, so you make sure you don't fund a program that Congress has prohibited. It establishes funds in the funds control system for a lot, both timing, the quarterly, and the amounts. So make sure that your accounting system can support those funds controls. Most systems now automatically will block transactions that exceed those controls. So setting those controls correctly is a huge part of that plan. And then ensuring that all funds are used appropriately and there's no lapsed funds, especially for 1 year or 2 year funds. And again, if they're only appropriated, a quarter into the year, then you've got 9 months to execute that funding as opposed to a year. So it's important to have that plan in place. So it's really a critical tool for managing the agency operations as they relate to the funding provided. So the operating plan really starts before the beginning of the fiscal year, kind of as that table Andy talked about. Many agencies start their operating plan with their president's budget request. The idea is that this is what we asked for, we should plan on executing that, and then modify that through the year as the House committees look at their bill and mark it up, either increases or decrease, and the same with the Senate, and move through each phase. So it's kind of like navigating. Every time it moves forward, you take a new bearing on where things are headed, what might affect the agency operations. If there's substantial funding for new activities, that needs to be kind of held in abeyance in the operating plan until the appropriation is provided, for 2 reasons. One, the base appropriation may not have the funding necessary to execute that. And there's also the issue that if it's truly new, then you can't fund it from a CR because that wasn't something Congress approved for funding prior. So it's important to understand where those changes are. It also helps understand, what operations may need a funding adjustment during the year, even against the routine appropriations. If the operating plan shows that a given program has an increase for, let's say, the initiation of an acquisition program, you'll know that we're going to have to find money for that somewhere else within the budget. And also seeing how plans, the funding was planned helps you and then seeing how they're executed, understand, okay, where can our plan be better and maybe better predict where we're going to execute it. If year after year you're constantly having to move money from program X to program Y, well, then maybe that feeds your formulation process to make that transfer, part of your request. So that transfer, and I'll say little t, not a transfer like we talked about and it has to go to Congress, but make that part of the, the appropriation request going forward, so it doesn't have to be done in execution every year. So the building blocks of the accounts are really, they build up from the OMB account, and kind of like Andy talked about, that traces all the way back to the president's budget request and the appropriations. Then those are broken into treasury accounts. And so those might be, more than one treasury account under one OMB account. And then there's the Treasury Appropriation Fund symbol, or the TAPS. And that, breaks it further down into the annual, the multi-year, and maybe the no-year piece. And so that really gives you the hierarchy of how those both trace from the details back up to the general and vice versa. The levels of planning are also different. So, of course, the department plans things at a different level, much more top level, much more strategic, those sort of things. The bureaus focus on their functions and their programs. They want to make sure that's aligned with their priorities and also the department's priorities. And it's a more detailed analysis. It's just a lower level of detail. And then dropping down to the office or programs, of course, that's the, typically the lowest level of detail. They're really focusing on the day-to-day or week-to-week obligations. When's this contract going to get awarded? When is that travel going to take place? Things of that nature. So it really, is appropriate to the level of focus at each level of the organization that they have to direct at what they're going to execute. And that goes to the top-down or bottom-up, planning. So whether an agency does top-down or bottom-up planning across the board is really a function of the overall management approach and other factors such as the agency size. A large agency like one of the major cabinet-level bureau agencies it'd be too unwieldy to necessarily do a bottoms-up plan or to review it at that level of detail because there'd just be so much data to go through. They'd never have time to do it. That's why they break things down as subordinate bureaus so they can look at it. And those bureaus would have flexibility to shift resources during execution to render a detailed bottom-up review out of date before it's even completed. So even at the bureau level, sometimes they really can't do a complete bottoms-up review. They're still dealing with summary data just at the summary, at their bureau level. And it's also possible an agency can employ different views for different entities. So a large, well-established bureau with a very stable sort of execution environment may be reviewed top down, even at the departmental level, while a new or maybe troubled program might get a much more lower level of review or more of a bottoms up so that the leadership can really understand the details of what's being proposed for execution. So it really depends on, kind of what the leadership likes. You'll have some leaders that want to do very detailed reviews, even at a high, organizational level, and others are content or are comfortable with doing a more top-down review and only looking at summary data. So question, does your agency do top-down or bottoms-up budget execution planning? Please answer in the chat. Yeah, I would expect probably a combination. Again, certain things are done very detailed. Certain things are done at a more summary level. And sometimes that's not always commensurate with the dollar value. Across the several agencies I've worked at, I'm always amazed at the level of attention that gets put on the travel budget. Sometimes it's only 1 or 2% maybe of the agency overall budget, but boy, everybody likes to, look at that travel budget in great detail. It's just one of those things. Okay. So the challenge of reviewing bottom-up requests are, the office or program will often, bristle a little bit this because they claim they know their business better. They are typically closer to the actual execution of the funding, but a well-executed program should be able to discuss detailed plans when required. In other words, they know the details. They should be able to communicate them when necessary and not necessarily be reluctant to, share those details. the budget analyst can really overcome these challenges through, mastery of some analytical techniques. So are they achieving their performance target? Is there funding, along the trend that's been established in prior years, let's say, or are there unexplained spending changes? Are they doing detailed contracts review that tie what they're doing, the obligations they're putting in contract to specific outputs or one-time projects, or they're contracts that just provide very generic sort of requirement that maybe not, is not clear what it's going to. Workforce analysis that looks at the workforce levels and the outputs, are most of the staff where most of the work is done, or are there imbalances there to look at? How does the plan of the program or office align with strategic goals and performance? In other words, are they spending the money where the agency's strategic plan or even the Bureau's strategic plan, says are the priorities? And if not, why? And then other techniques, that can be looked at, again, to look at, are things consistent? Do they line up with what they say they're doing? And if they're not, then those are fair questions that the budget analyst, especially at the departmental level, should be seeking from the Bureau or program to understand, what's actually being executed. So in the planning steps, as I said, that begins that, as soon as there's any degree of clarity about the likely appropriation. So like I said, it can often start with the president's budget and then be marked up, as the committees look at the budget. It identifies budgetary resources for both base or continuing ongoing needs and new initiative. And so many agencies split that because they look at what's the base initiatives, the things that have to be funded to, for continuity of operations, and then what funding has been requested or provided for new initiatives that both due to its amount and due to restrictions can't be provided until the appropriations provided, until it's approved. And so that way they can segregate, which funds need to go where the soonest, so the timing aspect comes into place. The op plan will typically show the distribution of those resources across the bureaus and programs. There may be dedicated appropriations that are designated or earmarked for those, or it may be a general account that the agency has the flexibility to spread, and they can spread that based on the prior information they have about that. And then the op plan also rolls up or summarizes, those details again up into a level that departmental or agency leadership is better able to grasp and understand and can see the big picture. And with the drill down, maybe they can see lower levels if that becomes an issue, but it rolls it up and summarizes so people can see it in several cuts. Maybe they can see totals by program, or different side of a data cube, they can see how much is being spent across their department on personnel or travel or contracts. But that roll up allows that data cube to be formed, and so they can look at it in different perspectives. The other thing that's really important in a operating plan is a listing of what's called unfunded requirements, or colloquially UFRs. And what those are things that couldn't quite be funded from the available amount. At this time, maybe they're just a slightly lower priority, maybe they're not quite mature enough for funding. But by maintaining a ready list of those, it avoids having to run repeated data calls to the bureaus or agencies, and allows the agency to pivot quickly and execute funding that may become available. So if program A, for whatever reason, has funding they're not going to be able to execute, then the UFR list can be referenced to quickly provide opportunities or options for additional funding to be placed in other places that can need it. The key to it is that it's got to be kept up to date, and the unfunded requirements must still be executable, within the time availability of the appropriation. So they still have to be something that, fits all the requirements in the appropriation, of course, and also can be executed in the time so that there's not lapsed funding. Just to make sure, we identify what budgetary resources are. So A11, as in many things, provides the definition of that. 20.3 defines budgetary resources as, quote, amounts available to incur obligations in a given year that consists of new budgetary resources consists of new budget authority and unobligated balances of prior authority provided in previous years, end quote. So, really it's like an inventory type thing. You have your beginning inventory if you have appropriations that allow you to carry over unobligated balances. You add that to new budget authority provided, in one of those ways that's listed, typically an appropriation, and the pool of those total resources provides your budgetary resources for the year. It's a pretty simple formula, and it really, again, depends on whether or not, your appropriation has unobligated balances. If it doesn't, then, of course, it's even simpler because that's just zero. And the budgetary resources are identified by line numbers. As Andy alluded to earlier, line 1200 is a mandatory appropriation, so it identifies it right there. And you can refer to Appendix F in A11 to look at those line numbers and see, where things are coming in. And those line numbers are important because they match from the president's budget all the way through the request for apportionment, or SF-132, and then the report, the SF-133 that's done. So having those line numbers in mind and knowing where they align is very important to match that all across those different reports and different systems. Object classification is probably what most people are the most familiar with. It's a key concept about what the government is spending its money on, not necessarily what it's buying, but the initial use of the funding. So its object classes describe pay, contracts, travel, all those things, and they're pretty consistent at the 3-digit level. So like 11.1 or 11.3, those all mean the same things in agency financial systems. I'll say 99% across federal government. Some agencies add a 4th digit and to provide more detail, but you can go look at A11 Section 83 for the list that establishes them for OMB, and almost all the federal financial system providers comply with that list.
Hey, Rick, we have a question. What makes up unobligated balances?
Okay, unobligated balances was literally just the level of funding provided by the appropriation minus the sum of the obligations that have been incurred. So if you received $100 million from Congress and you've only spent $85 million, then you've got $15 million unobligated balance. And then whether that funding would be available in subsequent fiscal years or not is subject to the conditions of the appropriation. I'll add one more neat thing. Again, no year approps. Because no year of funding has available until expended, it means even an obligation from 5 or 6 years ago that somehow is erased. Let's say the contractor didn't perform, the contract was canceled, that budget authority would become available again and would become an unobligated balance available to the agency. So one of the things we'll drill down on is, personnel compensation is a major element in most agencies' budget. In fact, unless they have major acquisitions or something outside that, it usually is the bulk of the funding the agencies are requesting and executing. It really, determines in the planning is to have the approach that, okay, how many people are we planning to hire and when are they going to come on board? What's going to generate vacancies? Do we see a high attrition level? Do we have a lot of retirements? Then how fast can we fill those vacancies? Because a major factor that shapes your personnel compensation budget is how long a position stays vacant, or a lapse rate. If someone retires in October and that position is not filled again until July, well, then the vast majority of the fiscal year has gone by without expending or obligating any funding for that position. And so it's just not going to require much funding, even if that position is filled, like I said, in July. And so knowing what that lapse rate is based on history and experience is very important to planning what your real expenditure is going to be for personnel compensation. You can start out a year with, assumption that we're going to have everybody on board, and then things can change, and then a lot of funding can be generated, if there's a lot of vacancies, let's say, or a lot of retirements. And then that funding, especially in a 1-year funding environment, you don't want to let it just, lapse or become expired. You want to, provide opportunities or look for opportunities for that funding to be reassigned to achieve agency perspectives. And that's where I'll say, again, that's where a UFR list can be very, very valuable. Just to reference back to some other material we provided, there is a budgetary chat there at the hyperlink there you can use on Max. And that provides we did an entire budgetary chat on some of the issues around projecting personnel compensation expenses. So I point you there for a lot more details about, some things that go into that and some of the complexities. So contracts are another big agency expense or big agency use of funding for a lot of agencies. And it's best to avoid just simple, inflation adjustments. We'll just mark up our contracts line by 5% or something, because there's usually a lot more details under there. There are contracts that are very steady, but there are also ones that may, have peaks and valleys in their execution experience, and it's important to understand those differences. Again, that often shapes when the funding is needed for like the quarterly apportionments. So getting that detail is really critical. You need to have one-time contracts, maybe something obligated last year and it's not going to obligate again. And that program may not have, need that funding again. And that funding may present an opportunity to be realigned to somewhere else. When the contracts are obligated, like I said, that's really big for planning apportionments. Maybe your apportionment doesn't just take your annual amount and divide it in 25% increments. Maybe you do a lot of contract awards in the second and third quarter, and therefore, that needs to shape your apportionment, and your operating plan can tell you that. It assures, that where new contracts are provided and whether they're aligning with strategic plan. It's understanding the escalation of existing contracts so that, if you've got contracts with escalation clauses in them, some contracts reference outside indices such that, like a benchmark inflation rate, and that allows the contractor to reset their prices. Having that in mind knows that if we have a period as we've experienced of higher inflation, that may require more funding in your operating plan than maybe what was requested, 18 months ago in the budget request. And so knowing that will inform where that funding needs to be directed. It's important to work with the procurement office. They manage those contracts. They have great visibility into them, and they can be a great source of information about, individual contracts, but also overall, behaviors and changes in that area of expenditure. I see a question real quick before we move on. What is the purpose of S&E funds, and are there time limits on S&E funds? So as Andy explained, S&E stands for salaries and expenses. So that's pretty descriptive. It's a lot of times it's, especially for smaller agencies, it may be their only appropriation. It funds everything. Another common phrase for that sort of appropriation is operations and maintenance. So it just really depends on the agency and its sort of tradition. In DoD, most of the DoD itself and the services have operations and maintenance accounts that pay their civilian pay. But the biggest expense in there is civilian pay, but it doesn't say salaries and expenses. So, but it's always been called operations and maintenance. So that's just kind of the way it is. And so, like I said, that'll fund almost everything in an agency that's not subject to a specific appropriation, as Andy talked about a little bit earlier. And is there a crosswalk between PPA code and project classification code? And you say PPA, I'm program and amount. And I was thinking amount, but it's
program, project, and activity.
Yes, program, project, right. Yes, there should be. You should keep those crosswalks. It may not be required necessarily specifically in the president's budget because it tends to have a PPA table and an object class table. And so there might not be that crosswalk, in the president's budget or in your CJ materials, but it's definitely something to do sort of, within the departmental bureau budget office to know what that crosswalk is, to know where your division, your PPA activities are spending their money. Are they spending it on travel and spending it on contracts? So some of those things. So yes, that crosswalk should be prepared and should be maintained to keep an eye on that. And that's all the questions we have. So I'll go to the next slide. Other object classes, like I said, travel. Everybody loves to look at travel. Congress often requires detailed information because there's been, in the last few years, there's been some, headline type abuse, of travel and things. So, travel generates a lot of attention. So it's good to keep an eye on that and to have detailed plans, especially if offices have a great deal of travel and especially a great deal of foreign travel. That also attracts a lot of attention for lots of reasons. So it's good to understand that one. Training, training should really be tied to individual development plans or career types. So if you've got, let's say law enforcement officers in your agency, there is specific training they have to go through, when they're hired, and there's specific refreshment training they need to periodically. And knowing what that pattern is allows you to make sure that the training budget is provided for, where that's needed and when it's needed. Sometimes some agencies kind of do a per person allocation, and that's, it's simple, but like a lot of simple things, it may miss some details. So it's not a great way to do it, but if that's better than completely guessing, that's better than that. But again, historical trends may be good to look at to see what what training expenditures have happened in the past, and to look at that. Rent is another important one. Most agencies are customers of GSA, so that they make the rent payments to GSA, but it can still understand what those schedules are, and what is changing, if the agency is acquiring space or giving up space, knowing when those changes will impact the rent budget. And if your agency does have specific individual lease authority, which is more and more rare, then the same thing, the commercial rent schedule could be important to understand, again, for the timing of when that funding needs to be provided in the budget so that rent payment can be made. Again, we also did a budget chat on estimating non-personnel costs, and that's available at the hyperlink that you can see there. So I'd refer you there for some more details about that. So as I said, unfunded requirement list. And, you'll say, man, this guy won't leave this unfunded requirement list alone. And I think it's because it's so important to, providing alternatives and options, especially for agency leadership, so that the budget execution group can really, have that value added input to things to show that they can indicate where the agency can pivot to make sure that funding gets executed. The long term perception is that unexecuted funding is unneeded funding. And, that may or may not be true. Oftentimes it's not. There's a lot of factors that go into why funding couldn't be obligated at a certain time. But the key is to, you want to stay out of that spotlight. Having high levels of unexecuted funding at the end of the period of availability is typically seen as a bad thing. And the UFOR list requires, enables the agency to quickly redirect funds that come available because of whatever situation to new to another use that gets those funds executed. It can be revised on a periodic basis and kept up to date, whatever that works for your agency, but it provides options again that can be executed and quickly, and not have to go out and ask programs for their list every couple of times when some money becomes available, and and then have to sort through that list again and go through it. So another key to that is that it's always a temptation to provide programs or bureaus exactly what they need, and the huge thing is who holds the management reserve. And sometimes it's useful if leadership will agree to provide a small degree of a little bit of management reserve to as low a level as possible, so that they can make those adjustments quickly and and spontaneously, again in the overall strategic goals, within the overall constraints on the appropriation, but they can make those adjustments quickly and agile in an agile type manner, so they can address funding and not have to work it up through an approval chain that may take weeks or something to get back to them, and they can take advantage of those opportunities. The key, again, having that executable UFOR list is really important to maximize the use of your appropriation. I see a question: can funds in the spend plan that is assigned to I think it's BOCs, be reprogrammed to different BOCs in the same appropriation? That's a great question, and it really, I hate to say it depends, but it depends on what Congress has allowed. It's funny, I worked at an agency where in our appropriation law, we had a 10% limit on how much money we could move into or out of travel. So we could not spend 10% more on travel across the entire agency than what we had in the president's budget. Than we requested, and so that became a big constraint on things, especially for a large nationwide agency that was involved in this. Again, kind of what Andy said, there probably was some history, maybe lost in the sands of time that, Congress wasn't, the Appropriation Committee wasn't happy with the agency and how they managed travel. And so they expressed that displeasure by putting that control on there. So it really depends on if your appropriation allows it or not. Some appropriations are completely silent on object class moves. Others may have a control. All right, so real quick, what are some reasons for creating an operating plan? Yep, great. Yep, those are all good. Yeah, exactly. The compliance with the appropriation requirements, and they're all equal. You really can't, they're all important. They've got to be balanced. One of the important things with understanding your appropriation is understanding, of course, the limits, but also understanding what flexibilities might be available. And so, it's not only knowing where the box, how big, where the box is, but how big the box is. What flexibilities are still available with that. And I can only reiterate what Andy said about, I used to have our appropriations law branch of our general counsel's office on speed dial because there was often questions that came up with, okay, can we use the funding for this, or what are our flexibilities and things. All right, Andy, over to you for warrants and apportionments.
Okay, we're going to go kind of an overview of warrants and appropriations, but I just want to note that we're going to have a whole class on apportionments starting at 1 o'clock today, because apportionments are really fundamental to everything you do in a budget office. But they're warrants and apportionments. To implement a spending plan, agencies need the legal authority to obligate funds and the ability to expend funds to pay obligations. So OMB apportionments provide the authority to obligate the funds. So if you have an apportionment, you can sign a contract, you can pay employees, you can obligate funds. But it's very important, you must have the the apportionment approved before funds may be obligated. So you can't send your apportionment request to OMB and then start obligating funds. You have to wait for OMB to approve the apportionment. Now, Treasury then sets up warrants as kind of the checkbook that enable agencies to draw funds to pay obligations. And these can come later in the year they don't have to be done at the beginning of the year. And next slide, I just like to put up the actual law. It's always kind of fun to go look at the law. And here is the actual code. And it says the Secretary of Treasury may pay out money only against a warrant. So if a warrant is not done, then the Secretary of Treasury, the Treasury Department, is not going to be paying for those contracts. And then it says the conditions that the warrant has to be authorized by law, signed by the Secretary, and countersigned by the Comptroller General. Of course, they have some ways of kind of getting around that. So the Secretary of Treasury isn't really signing every warrant. They've got delegated authorities and ways to get through that. But then you can see here that there's a dispersing official within the agency that sends over the request. So I just wanted to give you a flavor of the law. Next slide. But what budget offices deal with mostly is apportionments. And Section 120 of OMB Circular A11 provides the instructions for completing apportionments. And it states clearly that an apportionment is an OMB approved plan to use budgetary resource. So the key word there is plan. So that's like in the previous section, we talked about all the things that go into planning. You need to have that done at least at a high level before you do your apportionment, specifically because it limits obligations you may occur for specific time periods and specific activity programs, projects, and activities. Or some combination of the two. So you have to have a logical plan in place before you go to OMB and ask for your apportionment. And apportionment is legally binding, right? The obligation expenditures that exceed an apportionment are a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. So it's important to get apportionments correct. Next slide. So apportionments are done by TAFs. They're made at the Treasury Appropriation Fund symbol level. All TAFs are required to be apportioned, except for some specific cases that we won't talk about. Treasury's Department Federal Account Symbols and Titles book, called the FAST book, maintains the official list of TAFs. A TAF specifies the agency or the department, the period of availability of funding, and the 4-digit federal account code. And so there's just an example. 036 is the Treasury code for the Department of Veterans Affairs. 20, so this is 2020, is the year it's available. And sometimes you'll see like 20/21, that means it's 2-year funding. And if there's an X, it's no year funding. And then you see the 4-digit account symbol for the actual accounts. In this case, it's compensation and pensions as part of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Next slide. So and we're going to go again in the next class, go over this in very much detail, but there's the required sections of apportionment. There's the top that has the name and the account. Then there's a budgetary resources section, because the OMB wants to know, where did the budget authority come from? And as we've talked about earlier, budget authority can come from various places. It can come from unobligated balances transferred from the previous year. It can come from transfers in from other accounts. It can come from appropriations, either mandatory or discretionary. So OMB asks you to specify exactly what the budgetary resources are. And then the second part is what's called the application of budgetary resources, which shows the amounts, the legal limits that restrict how much an agency can obligate by projects, programs, and activities, and by time period. So those are the 3 points. And again, we'll cover this in more detail in the next class. Next slide. So unless you're exempt from apportionment, which there are very, very few cases of that, all multi-year and no-year TAFs with unexpired budgetary resources available for obligation must be apportioned every fiscal year. So if you have a 2-year account or a no-year account, you can't just do one apportionment at the beginning of the period of availability and then expect it to last. So if you have a no-year account, you have to do an apportionment every year. You have to every single year. The format is prescribed in A11. The LMB has a web system for doing this. It's a web-based apportionment system where you send your apportionments in and then they process them. But every new apportionment in a fiscal year supersedes the previous apportionment actions taken earlier in that year. So as you go through the year, and this is especially for things like offsetting collections. So let's say you have an apportionment, because remember, all funds must be apportioned. So let's say you're managing the national park system and you expected the revenue from the park entrance fees to be, I'm just making a number up, $10 million. And so you put in an apportionment based on that expectation. But let's say that actually the park is more popular than planned and you got $20 million of fees because more people showed up than you expected. You have to change the apportionment for the year. You submit a new apportionment that adds that extra $10 million. But once that's done, that supersedes the previous apportionment. And apportionments are never subject to change after the period for which the apportionment is made. So at the end of the fiscal year, you can't go back after the fiscal year is over and change the apportionment for that fiscal year. And think about why that's so, because if you could reapportion things after the end of the fiscal year, you could never have an anti-deficiency act because you just go back and change the apportionment. So you can't do that. The Anti-Deficiency Act is binding on the last approved apportionment before the account expiration. So as you make adjustments to the apportionments for an account, that you pay attention to the last one. Next slide. Question, why is a warrant required prior to executing budget authority?
And after this, there's a few questions in the chat we may want to deal with too, Andy.
Okay, why don't you give the answer to our question and deal with the questions?
So one of the questions was, is a treasury warrant different than a contracting officer's warrant? And I'll say yes. That's
yes.
The warrant idea. A warrant, generically is a permission from a higher authority. And so in the treasury warrant case, it's permission from the Secretary of Treasury, to set up the account as Andy described. In a contracting officer's warrant, it's a permission from the agency, procurement authority that's designated by law to incur those obligations to the government. So it's the same term, the same idea, but yes, they are very different.
And there's the question in my example, yeah, that it would be that the new apportionment would be for the new $20 million. And that's allowing the agency to obligate funds that they got collected from the fees.
There's one here. So if a negative subsidy benefit is higher than anticipated, would a new apportionment have to be submitted? Of course, I love when negative, I get into negatives being different,
well,
but yeah, it's different the apportionment, then a new apportionment's required.
And that brings up the whole credit reform, and that is a whole different animal because they do forecasts and apportionments based on the forecasts and the models, and that's a whole different animal. And we want to do a class in the future on credit reform, but that is a special species. But the bottom line is, yeah, you have to do apportionments for loans and adjusted, and those apportionments are adjusted based on the results of models.
There's a question at the bottom here. If you do not spend all the current fiscal year of a multi-year, can you use it in the following year? Yes, if it's apportioned. So one of the things that can happen, and it has other ramifications, but just because an agency has a multi-year or no year appropriation and has unobligated balances, OMB does not necessarily have to reapportion those unobligated balances in the subsequent year. Like I said, it has other ramifications, but it's not automatic. So the carryover balances have to be apportioned again. Typically they do, or Congress can do what's called a rescission. They can actually, in the appropriation law, say hereby rescinded from this account unobligated balances of X amount, and then that funding would no longer be available. So while a multi-year appropriation, typically is available for multiple years, it's no guarantee. Either Congress or OMB can take action to recapture those funds.
So to answer the question we put before, it's basically because 31 U.S. Code Section 3323 requires it. The Treasury is not allowed to expend money to issue checks for anything that does not have a warrant. I think it's over to you, Rick.
Yep. Allocations and allotments of budget authority. And so we're going to talk about these. This is getting into, so now your apportionment has been approved. The agency has the funds, and it's time to, push that funding, into the agency infrastructure so that it can be executed. So, just to clarify the relationships, OMB controls the apportionment, and that's laid out in section 120 of A11. And then the allotments and allowances are described in section 150 of A11 and Appendix H. And so just so you know, kind of which parts of A11 speak to which parts of those activities. So the allocation requirements are placed on the head of the executive agency, and there's the U.S. Code there. The head of the executive agency is required to allocate funds in writing. So, there can't be, the secretary said I have $10 million to spend. It's got to be done in writing, or in the system. Now, those allocations have to be recorded, in the financial system. And they, again, sometimes agency heads will delegate this to their CFO or maybe, someone else. But it's still, there's a clear chain of authority back to that, and it exists in a recorded transaction, a la written document, to make sure that there's that audit trail. The administrative division of apportionments is, that the secretary has to maintain, or the head of the agency has to maintain a set of procedures and a set of controls to make sure that restricts expenditures to the amount of the apportionment. In other words, it should be very, very difficult, if not impossible, for someone to spend money that's not available in the apportionment. And that includes the quarterly or programmatic breakdown in section B. In other words, if OMB is only given a discrete amount for a given program in a given quarter, even though the full amount was appropriated, during that time period, only that up to that amount can be obligated. And it ensures the ability, that control system ensures the ability to fix responsibility for any obligation or expenditure, to an official that made it. So whether it be a contracting officer or whether it be someone else, the system has to be sure that it identifies who's responsible for making that decision. And again, OMB guidance is available in section 150 and Appendix H to go over that. And Appendix H is pretty much the complete checklist of what is required in funds control regulations. And each agency has to have one of those policies that's approved by OMB, and they pretty much all mirror Appendix H, almost exactly. So allotments, allocations, and allowances, kind of the 3 A's. What are the differences? And they're important because an allotment is a formal distribution of apportioned funds by the agency or department or agency CFO from typically a headquarters budget office to a bureau or other components. So it carries the same legal limitations as the apportionment. And this is key. It's subject to the Anti-Deficiency Act. So if a department or the receiver of an allotment does something to exceed that, they have, likely committed an Anti-Deficiency Act violation and has to be followed up with accordance with the agency's funds control policy. So allotments are subject to Anti-Deficiency Act. Allocations are typically a further, or I'll say lower level distribution. So maybe that's from a bureau to a program or something of that nature. And they're subject to the conditions set out in the allotment. But the key difference is they are not subject to the Anti-Deficiency Act. So just exceeding the terms of an allocation won't necessarily automatically trigger an Anti-Deficiency Act, concern or finding, as long as the total all the allocations don't exceed the allotment. Again, that kicks it up to the allotment problem. And then some agencies, do a further distribution using allowances. And similar to allocations, they're, I'll say, informal in that they're not quite as stringent as an allotment, and they are not subject to the Anti-Deficiency Act. So again, it really depends on the size of the agency and the complexity of its financial approach, whether they use all 3 of these, and maybe whether they use multiple allotments or not. Some agencies have a single allotment and they manage it, at the headquarters level. Others may have multiple allotments. So it just depends. Excuse me. Based on the operating plan, the budget office will determine and issue the allotments, allocations, or allowances, whatever they're appropriate and whatever they've done in the past, and in accordance with their specific funds control, their policy. And so, again, it all sings together. The policy talks about how we're supposed to do it, and then the execution follows that to make sure it's in line with the policy. So execution. So, now we finally get to spend some money. Boy, after all that, we're finally talking about, maybe spending some money. So the execution steps are, pretty much, tracking the obligations, recording them as they occur. And again, most, modern financial systems are interfaced with a procurement system. When the contracting officer signs a contract, it will pass a transaction to the financial system to record that obligation. If not, then that's a manual process that has to be, maintained and done very, rigorously. Analyzing the operating plan against the actual differences. So periodically, whether that's weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever is appropriate, looking at, okay, we provided $50 million, for this quarter for this program. How are they spending it through this quarter? Are they on track? Is it expected to execute? Or are there gaps there that need to be, reviewed? And if there's gaps, either they're spending, in addition, maybe ahead of what the plan was or behind, what are the options for adjusting that plan? Again, all the way back to what flexibilities do we have in the apportionment? What flexibilities do we have in the appropriation that might allow us to redirect that funding in different ways to make sure it's executed? Typically, most agencies do monthly or quarterly briefs. Again, it may depend on the level in the agency or the level of interest or level of focus management wants to do on that. Some agencies do maybe quarterly briefs for the first 3 quarters and then monthly briefs in the fourth quarter to really keep track of things as we sort of bring it in for a landing, so to speak, to monitor things. And then budget reallocations, can be, the outcome of those reviews and the outcome of those plans when something is not quite executing according to plan.
Hey, Rick, we have a question.
Yeah, I was gonna check them.
Does OMB only receive the apportionment and any organization receive an allotment?
Well, OMB only receives and approves apportionments. And after that, it would be within the agency or department that allotments take place. And so again, commensurate with their funds control policy would be, what allotments are made. And then of course, subject to the amounts, would be how big those allotments are, what the dollar value is. So yeah, OMB does apportionments. After that, now, they may monitor allotments, again, in the SF 133 and other reporting documents, they may be able to monitor those allotments. But it really is the agency to make those and control them. Okay. So in analyzing plan versus actuals, and the differences, it's really the first step in budget execution to look at those differences and see where things are going. So, ensure there's no overspending, and whether that's just, maybe a timing thing, maybe they obligated a contract a little bit sooner, a month before it was originally in their plan, but yet the whole plan is still going to stay the same, or is there really overspending of some nature? Maybe they're traveling more than they planned, and now, they need to adjust for that in later, months or quarters remaining in the fiscal year. The opposite is to identify areas of underspending and whether those will be resolved. Maybe they're late in awarding a contract, and they'll still achieve their overall plan. It just won't happen in the same month that originally it was in the plan, or the same quarter in the plan, or maybe they won't, and those funds again can be realigned possibly. It's really, that's what it comes down to, is looking at the operational impact of those differences. Is it something that needs to be addressed? Do things need to be adjusted to avoid any impacts, or to avoid any non-achievement of performance goals or objectives? And looking and see what options are available to make sure that the agency still achieves what it needs to do.
So we're coming towards the end here. We only have a couple more minutes. So I guess what we would say is let's skip the question and just kind of go through it real quick.
Okay. So it's important for budget analysts to, have a good basis for, making recommendations for adjusting the plans. They have to understand what's changing the forecast. Are there unexpected events? Did hiring or contract spending take, a different pattern than what was, planned? Are there new priorities that have become element? Are there new things that have, are now requirements that have to be? There's external guidance. As the GAO report just come out that said the program or office has some deficiency somewhere. So now, resources may have to be directed to correct those deficiencies. And in developing recommendations, it's important to have clear recommendations that are easily understood by, the busy executives that need to review them. So, clear, concise is always a strength, so they grasp what's going on and can make a clear decision. They also have to, you want to be able to explain implications and second and third order effects. If we fund this program with this incremental resources, what does it do to these other areas? If they need to execute more contracting funding, can the procurement office support that? Those sort of questions need to be sussed out and make sure they're understood. And again, that everything is executable. Is it feasible? Can we hire the people in the time remaining? Can we execute the procurements? If not, then it's not really a viable option, as an alternative, because it's, we're just going to move the money and then have it languish there. Again, that unfunded requirements list is key to that. Having those put together and solid can really, help you execute that funding smartly and still comply with congressional guidance, and make sure that you don't run afoul. Some reprogramming notifications, I've worked in agencies where we could not move more than a certain amount between our PPA activities. And so we had to know every time we moved funding, whether or not we were going to touch that reprogramming limit. And if so, we may, possibly decide not to make that transfer or we might proceed with it knowing that we first have to get the requisite approvals.
So we're coming to noon and we want to respect everyone's time. So there's a couple slides here on reprogramming that just talks about shifting funds within appropriation account for a purpose that is different from what Congress stated. And again, there's details here about that. Let's go to the
one
next.
thing important to point out is reprogramming is not always objective or numeric. Congress can put qualitative issues into reprogramming guidance. So it's critical that you review your appropriations and report language to understand those. Congress can have things like if you open or close an office, we have to be notified before you can do that. So that's an important thing to notice, that they're not always numeric reprogramming limits.
Okay, go to the next slide real quick. And just
really
more,
the best takeaway from
go
these is that you've got to review your specific, documents. There's different committees do different things for every, often for within each of the 12 appropriation acts.
And so when we get to the section on reporting and year end, well, we're going to be covering this information in our class beginning at 2:30 this afternoon. So the slides are here. If you can preview them and look at them. And the key point here is that there's something called, go to the next couple slides. We're going to skip through. So there is something called stay here. There's something called an SF-133, and we're going to talk about the SF-133 this afternoon in detail. The 4 pieces of it. Let's go to the next slide. So the last part of execution is the year-end close, and it's important that the funds expiring at the end of the fiscal year be fully obligated by that date. And also it's important to note that a pattern of unobligated amounts may lead OMB or Congress to conclude that their budget for the following year should be reduced. So, if you keep habitually having lots of money left over, they may take it away in the next year. And then one more slide. Year-end close is a joint process. You work hand in hand with the financial managers, and it builds on monthly reviews. The finance office does the actual close, and it prepares the year-end financial budget execution reports and submits that data to Treasury's GTAS, which again we'll talk about later this afternoon. And so I think that wraps us up. And we'll talk more about SF-133s this afternoon. Sorry for going a couple minutes over, but it's a big topic and we appreciate your patience.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy and Rick. We appreciate it. Thank you so much. And we will begin at 1 p.m. for our next session, Intro to Apportionments, and that will be from 1 to 2:15 this afternoon. So please join us back if you have registered for that course. Again, thank you all for your time this afternoon, and I hope you enjoyed lunch. We will be recording this, and we will post this within 2 weeks onto our max.gov webpage. Again, the feedback survey will be coming out this afternoon, so please provide your feedback and insight there. But I won't stand in between lunch, and enjoy your lunch, and we'll see you at 1. Have a good one. Thanks, Andy and Rick.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Gina and Heidi as well.